Hey everyone, and welcome. So, have you ever actually wondered what happens to a massive democracy when the unthinkable occurs? When a nation faces a true existential crisis? Regular everyday laws just don't cut it. Today, we are opening up Part 18 of the Indian Constitution. Think of this as the ultimate rulebook for national crises. It is this incredibly fascinating, highly structured set of emergency provisions, and it's literally designed to keep the country intact when it feels like everything else is falling apart.
All right, so what you are seeing on screen right now is the actual source material for today's explainer. It's a heavily fact-dense Hindi textbook page that outlines exactly how these emergency powers work. Now, looking at a giant wall of text like this can be a bit overwhelming, right? So we are going to dissect this exact page, translate these absolutely crucial facts into English, and make the whole thing visually clear and super easy to grasp.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our quick roadmap for today. 1. Basics in National Emergency under Article 352. 2. The history of national emergency. 3. President's rule under Article 356. And 4. Financial emergency under Article 360. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. Basics and National Emergency. Understanding Article 352. Let's start right at the top of Part 18, which spans from Articles 352 to 360, focusing first on the absolute highest level of alert.
So, according to Article 352, a national emergency isn't just something that gets declared on a whim. There are 3 very specific extreme conditions under which this can be invoked: war, external aggression, and armed rebellion. And it's really important to note exactly how this is activated. The president is the one who makes the declaration, but they don't just do it alone. They do it specifically on the advice of the central cabinet.
Now, our source text includes a critical historical pivot regarding those 3 conditions. Before 1978, that third ground for a national emergency was legally termed internal disturbance. However, the 44th Constitutional Amendment of 1978 specifically came in and replaced the phrase internal disturbance with a much more strictly defined term, which is armed rebellion.
So how does this literally play out procedurally? Well, it's a 3-step mechanism. Step 1, the central cabinet provides their advice. Step 2, the president officially declares the emergency. But here is Step 3, and this is where the checks and balances kick in. It absolutely must be approved by Parliament. Once Parliament gives it the green light, the emergency remains in effect for 6 months. However, if the crisis is ongoing, Parliament can extend it indefinitely, just taking it 6 months at a time.
Now, you might be wondering, what happens to regular citizens during all of this? Well, generally speaking, fundamental rights can actually be suspended during a national emergency, but our source explicitly points out a major exception. Articles 20 and 21 remain absolutely protected. They cannot be suspended no matter what. Additionally, during this period, the normal term of the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament, can actually be extended by 1 year at a time.
Moving on to Section 2, the history of national emergency, when Article 352 was invoked. Now that we understand the actual rules of a national emergency, let's take a look at how these immense powers have played out in the real world. And this brilliantly illustrates the history, pulled straight from our textbook source. India has actually been under a national emergency exactly 3 times. First, in 1962, based on external aggression, under President Dr. S. Radhakrishnan and Prime Minister Pandit Nehru. Then again, in 1971, also for external aggression, with President V.V. Giri and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. The third time was in 1975, invoked under that pre-1978 basis of internal disturbance, with President Fakhruddin Ali and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi.
Looking specifically at that third emergency, our source records a highly specific detail regarding its legacy. The third national emergency was implemented on June 25, 1975. The textbook text notes that this date of June 25 will be marked as Samvidhan Hacha Divas, which translates directly to Constitution Murder Day.
All right, Section 3. President's rule under Article 356, state-level emergencies. Let's shift gears for a second. We've talked about nationwide crises, but what happens when a crisis is isolated to just one specific state? Well, that brings us to Article 356.
The trigger for Article 356 is entirely different from a national emergency. President's rule is imposed when the constitutional machinery essentially fails within a specific state. Basically, it means the state government can no longer function according to the Constitution. The declaration is made by the president, but in this case it is specifically based on the written advice of that particular state's governor.
Now, the procedural steps here are going to look pretty familiar.
governor's written advice, leading to a presidential declaration, followed by parliamentary approval. And just like the national emergency, once approved, it's valid for 6 months. But wait, there is a massive difference here. President's rule actually has a hard maximum time limit. According to our source, it can only be extended for a maximum of 3 years. After that, normal state governance absolutely must be restored.
So any guesses on how often this happens? Remember how national emergency was only used 3 times total? Well, look at this number, over 125 times. That is how often President's rule has been imposed across various states in India so far. It is a wildly stark contrast in frequency when you compare it to Article 352. To put that massive 125-plus number into perspective, the textbook drops some really interesting trivia for us. The very first time President's rule was ever imposed was in the state of Punjab way back in 1951. And if you're wondering which states have seen it the most, Uttar Pradesh and Manipur actually tie for the maximum usage, having both been placed under President's rule a staggering 10 times each.
Finally, Section 4, Financial Emergency under Article 360, the Economic Safeguard. We've covered wars, armed rebellions, and the breakdown of state governance. But what happens if the country literally just runs out of money? This brings us to the final tier of the emergency provisions.
The core function of Article 360 is pure economic self-preservation. It's imposed when a severe situation arises that threatens the financial stability or the overall credit of India. And just like the other emergencies, the president is the one who declares this, acting on the written advice of the central cabinet.
Now, you've got to pay close attention to this specific procedural quirk. It requires parliamentary approval, just like the others. But unlike President's rule, which caps out at 3 years, or the national emergency, which requires a strict check-in every 6 months, the source highlights that once a financial emergency is approved by Parliament, it remains in effect for an indefinite period of time.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this number right here, 0. Despite the immense, indefinite power contained within Article 360, the textbook confirms that a financial emergency has never, not even once, been imposed in India to date.
So, what does this all mean? We've just taken a really dense page of textbook information and visualized the sheer weight of Part 18 of the Constitution. From 3 national emergencies to over 125 instances of President's rule, down to 0 financial emergencies. It really leaves us with a compelling final thought. How does the Constitution successfully balance these immense, almost absolute emergency powers with the long-term endurance of a democracy? It is pretty much a testament to the resilience of this rulebook. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep exploring the incredible balance of power.